patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 49 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you so much for joining us this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Make sure you subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens so that you don't miss our episodes that come out every Monday. Today, I'd like to explore a topic that I haven't frequently explored, even though we have been in the COVID-19 pandemic a lot. And I'm talking about public health. Public health is an area that we have touched upon a bit. I've asked about COVID-19 for some of the questions I've posed to guests. But today I'd like to focus on a case that has so much precedent and has so much weight and value in what we're debating nowadays. With the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of things have changed, from the way that people work to, unfortunately, how people are acting in our society. Some people really have lost their minds, and it's really unfortunate to see some of the conflicts that people have started and inflamed throughout this time. Today, I'd like to cover a case that I really think should be taught a lot more in schools. It's definitely a case that was controversial then, and maybe probably less controversial nowadays. But nevertheless, it really divided a number of people at the time. In 1902, there was a smallpox outbreak in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Massachusetts at the time was one of those few states that required vaccinations for those who were over the age of 21. And they could basically just say, you know what, we have a public health emergency, you need to get vaccinated. And if you didn't get vaccinated, you would be subject to a $5 fine. $5 now translating to about $150 in 2020. Now, well, there's one guy, a Cambridge pastor named Henning Jacobson. He originally was from Sweden, and he didn't like this new policy from Cambridge, Massachusetts regarding the vaccines. He just simply didn't believe it worked. But also, he didn't want to get vaccinated because he believed that his health would be in jeopardy. I'm not sure how passionate he was in this particular argument, but he was saying that his family might have some kind of hereditary health problem regarding vaccines, and therefore he just could not take this one here. Well, Massachusetts didn't really care about that, and pursuant to the law, he was fined that $5. And Jacobson sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and it took 3 years until finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the basic question really was, do these vaccinations infringe on personal freedoms? Jacobson's argument was that the law was, quote, unreasonable, arbitrary, and oppressive, unquote. And he's also saying that people should not be penalized for choosing to object to a vaccination, regardless of the reasons. And the court heard our oral arguments on December 6, 1904, and as they were debating, the court realized that this is not something, this argument from Jacobson was just not valid. And so on February 20th, 1905, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that Massachusetts law did not violate the 14th Amendment, which is the amendment also known by the Equal Protection Clause. The court was led by Justice Harlan, Justice Harlan, by the way, is one of my favorite Supreme Court justices. I'll be sure to make a episode recording about him sometime in the future. But Justice Harlan, I think, writes a decision that has a lot of meaning to it and something very applicable to nowadays. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read parts of his opinion and identify with some of these sentences and how they relate to the issues that were on hand then and the issues that are happening now. Now, the first thing you have to realize is that the court was saying within a society, you can't just have everybody exercise liberty entirely. And it's obvious why that's the case. For example, if there's someone who wanted to rob someone, you can't let that person do whatever he or she wants. So already there is a line between, what is considered freedom and the, not constraints, but just the overall rules within society that you have to abide by if you're going to live there. And what the court was saying is that in a public health and public safety crisis, there is police power within a state that can allow it to have regulations and legislation to ensure that the general welfare is preserved. Now, this is a bit cloudy here because there are some other things that are in play. But I'd like to read, starting on page 35 of this opinion. Unquote, unquote, a common belief, like common knowledge, does not require evidence to establish its existence, but may be acted upon without proof by the legislature and the courts. Unquote. Now, this is a really interesting statement here. The whole premise with this quote here, the court is saying that a belief, an idea of some kind, doesn't need evidence to show that it exists. There are going to be people who will believe one way or another, and there's no evidence or anything that requires that it can exist in one form or another. The court goes on and says, the fact that the belief is not universal is not controlling, for there is scarcely any belief that is accepted by everyone. And I'll stop there for a second. Now, earlier I said that it may be that a common belief may be acted upon without proof by the legislature and the courts. This kind of hints onto something that the quote will eventually reveal. But the fact that it says the belief is not universal is not controlling. I mean, imagine how much different people would act if they understood that not everyone is going to believe the same way as they believe. I mean, isn't that genius? It's really astounding how something like this is super relevant, and yet it's not widely accepted as you can probably imagine. It says, for there's scarcely any belief that is accepted by everyone. I mean, just the fact that the court acknowledges is already a big deal. It continues, it says, the possibility that the belief may be wrong and that science may yet show it to be wrong is not conclusive. For the legislature has the right to pass laws which, according to the common belief of the people, are adapted to prevent the spread of contagious diseases. Unquote. This is so fascinating because it says the possibility of the belief may be wrong. So in essence, let's say that the state of Massachusetts, in this example, said you need to have vaccine. It does not matter how many times people say, well, that could be wrong, and well, we don't have enough science, we don't have enough data, we don't have this and that. So Massachusetts is wrong because it could be proven wrong. Not the case at all, especially what the court just said. Science is an evolving subject, clearly. I mean, we're not saying that science doesn't change or that whatever the government says is science. Scientific debate, I think, should be separate from what we're dealing with here in this case and in a lot of the debates that we're having regarding policy during COVID-19. But what it is saying is that you cannot just say, well, I don't like what this government is doing, and therefore I'm just exempt because I have a belief and everyone else should respect it. Well, yes, in essence, you can have free speech. If you want to express disapproval of something, you have the right to free speech. But when it comes to a vaccination, this is when the court is saying the state has this police power and to make sure that everyone is safe and that there are no injuries from other people's liberties. Now, again, it's very, very complex, especially when you're dealing with COVID-19. Clearly, this case is not from a pandemic. It's actually dealing with quite a local case, and we're dealing with Cambridge, Massachusetts, and really the state of Massachusetts, which in itself is not a huge place at all. But it's really astounding how the court is recognizing that ultimately it's the legislature that has the right to pass laws and to do all the things that it is saying. Why is that so obvious? Well, it's because so many people nowadays are assuming that the scientists have the control over what is passed as policy and law. And the reality is that is not the United States. That is not how we run our country. Regardless of what people think about a particular scientist or a group of scientists, ultimately the power is within the legislature. That is so important to recognize. That even kind of opens up debate about the powers of the executive. Now, that's not to say, okay, and just you can do whatever you want about what the governor tells you to. That's not the point. The point is there is a lot of authority out there that is not being recognized by people, and that power is already within the people whom we elect on a regular basis, and those are our lawmakers. So whatever people say about scientists and what they agree with and disagree with, ultimately, scientists have the power to advise, right? They have the power to advise. They can do what citizens have the right to do. So they have the right to petition. They have the right to and talk to their legislators and tell them why they're right or why they're wrong. They can still be a part of the citizenry and of the civics. What isn't okay is over-glorifying scientists and assuming that, well, politics has to be guided by the science, or all the laws have to be guided by science. As this court says, that does not have to happen. Because we are living in a republic, it's ultimately the faith and the power system in which we live in that the legislature has that power to implement these measures. And the Massachusetts government, I'm sure they said, well, we've consulted with the scientists based on our knowledge. Here are the policies. And if people don't like what these legislators do, the people can vote them out, or they can reelect them. This is how our system of government works. It really flies right in the face of a lot of what is unfortunately now becoming conventional wisdom, which kind of assumes that science is a different universe to politics, and that we've never seen, science be so politicized and everything. I mean, again, scientific debate is another area where scientists and others in that community can have honest conversations about data and results. But ultimately, people who say that, well, you need to follow the science, well, that's kind of like saying, well, you need to follow the economics, or you need to follow the politics. Well, and people debate on economics, so how can people assume that science is completely settled? As the court continues here, it says, and this is something really, really important to note out, quote, in a free country where the government is by the people through their chosen representatives, practical legislation admits of no other standard of action. For what the people believe is for the common welfare must be accepted as tending to promote the common welfare, whether it does in fact or not. Any other basis would conflict with the spirit of the Constitution and would sanction measures opposed to a Republican form of government, unquote. The big thing here with these two statements is that, kind of like as I said earlier, the legislature, and more particularly, it's the representative democracy in a federal republic that is the number one system to make changes. It really goes back to the roots of what our nation is founded. Just because a pandemic happens doesn't mean that a federal republic goes away. We still have a system of government. I'll use a simple example. Look at the people who, for example, and recently there's been reinstatement of a mask mandate for employees in public areas in Clark County, which is the Las Vegas area. Every single one of those commissioners on the Clark County are, some of them are probably going to run for re-election. Guess what? People have the ultimate right to have conversations and have debates by all means. This is actually what we should be doing more. We should have people debating and having these conversations so that legislators, lawmakers can listen in and make their decisions. But what isn't okay is to assume that Clark County and the commissioners of Clark County, are completely listening to science and they don't acknowledge what is happening. It's still politics. They have re-elections to look forward to. Some of them maybe retiring. I don't know. But the point is, governments don't make decisions because they do it for an institution of science. I'm also not saying that they're doing it for selfish purposes entirely. It's a combination of a number of different factors that come into play within our system of representative democracy. And that's what I really want people to take away, which is our representative democracy is still functioning in a pandemic. It is not all of a sudden a science experiment or some kind of way so that we can serve the institution of science. As great as that is in principle, and something that I think should be abided in classrooms or even just among the civil discourse of people, it is not really how these powers work. As I kind of reflect on this decision and the impact, we've realized that a lot of people are not having conversations anymore about public health. There's a lot of villainization happening. I'm very concerned that there's people on both sides who don't understand, and both sides, when I say both sides, I mean people on differing sides of various different issues. I do believe that the vaccine is incredibly important. The efficacy is phenomenal. It did not happen overnight. It wasn't like the FDA just dreamt up a vaccine and invented it. This is years of research and development that goes back a long, long time. And I do believe there are people we should be thanking for not only allowing this process to happen, but to happen so quickly. It is just absolutely unprecedented with all these vaccines. I also believe that this case here, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, it does give that police power to governments. And it was also a catalyst for the anti-vaccine movement, which happened not too long after the decision. But I believe the larger picture here is essentially saying that we cannot be punishing the majority of people because of the actions of a minority. I found a passage here later in this case. It says from the court, "We are unwilling to hold it to be an element in the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States that one person or a minority of persons residing in any community and enjoying the benefits of its local government should have the power thus to dominate the majority when supported in their action by the authority of the state." While this court should guard with firmness every right appertaining to life, liberty, or property as secured to the individual by the supreme law of the land, it is of the last importance that it should not invade the domain of local authority except when it is plainly necessary to do so in order to enforce that law." Unquote. I think about the federalism that has worked throughout this nation, from the vaccination rollouts to the different policies regarding mask mandates and lockdowns. People should have a choice as to which constituency they want to live in, and their voices will ultimately be decided in elections. We need to cherish the representative democracy in our federal republic. Even the court in this case said that they can't just intervene anywhere. They will only intervene when there is a kind of injustice or oppression on particular groups of people. Understanding the value of our representative democracy is what's going to ensure that we don't veer towards authoritarianism, that we keep to our roots, that we keep towards the ideas of freedom and opportunity and justice. And I believe it starts with every single one of us. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember that a day in America always gets better when we're with our friends and fellow citizens.